32-year-old Morris Blankenbaker was a very happy man. The gymnasium at Wapato Intermediate School in Yakima County, Washington, echoed with the sound of young teenage boys practicing their wrestling moves on thick green mats. And Morris was right there with them, whistle on a cord around his neck, shouting directions and encouragement as he moved from one group of kids to another. As far back as he could remember, the thump of bodies hitting the mats and the rhythm of other youngsters in a tight line at the edge of the gym doing calisthenics had always been music to Morris's ears. It had been 14 years since Morris himself had graduated from high school 15 miles to the north, along with his armload of sports trophies, the title of Best Athlete of 1961, and a 4-year scholarship to play football in college. But even though he had not achieved his dream of becoming a professional football player, Morris had never for a second lost his love of sports, both playing them and coaching them. But on this particular day, Friday, November 21st, 1975, Morris's sense of happiness and satisfaction with his life went much deeper than normal. Because the last 2 years of Morris's life had taught the former Golden Boy of Yakima County that the really important things in life were the two things he had come so close to losing: his marriage to his high school sweetheart, Deanne, and the joy of living under the same roof with her and their 2 young children. Though no one, not even Deanne and definitely not Morris himself, could ever have predicted the chain of events that had temporarily led to his separation and divorce from Deanne. And while Morris knew the shockwaves from those events were still reverberating throughout his work and social circles, the last few days had brought both Morris and Deanne a very rare feeling of calm and peace. And as they both looked forward to Thanksgiving together, just 6 days away, Morris had to believe that all the turmoil of the last 2 years was finally ebbing out of their lives, and that going forward, he and Deanne would never again take each other for granted. The sudden ring of the school bell pulled Morris back to the present. With a quick glance at the clock on the wall, he raised the whistle around his neck up to his mouth, and he blew 2 sharp blasts to signal the end of the practice. A moment later, and the boys were hauling their mats back to the hooks on the walls at either end of the gym. Hearing their respectful, "Thanks, coach, goodbyes," as the teenagers filed past him on their way into the locker room to change, Morris remembered an earlier scene from his own adolescence, and he felt a stab of pain. He had been just a few years older than these kids when he had first met his own favorite coach, Talmadge Glenn Moore, back in Davis High School 16 years ago. Known to everyone in Yakima County by his nickname, Gabby, and known to all the boys he had coached in everything from wrestling to track to football as just Coach, Gabby was one of Yakima's local celebrities. Ever since getting his first job coaching at Washington Junior High School back in 1958, Gabby had quickly moved up the career ladder, and by 1969, he'd made a name for himself as one of the most outstanding wrestling coaches in the entire country. And in 1972, at the very height of his career, Gabby had coached the David High School wrestling team all the way to first place in the Washington State Championships. But instead of accepting any offers to coach at the collegiate level, Gabby and his wife had chosen to stay in Yakima, a small agricultural town separated from the much larger city of Seattle to the north by the beautiful Cascade Mountain Range. And it wasn't just Gabby's coaching talent that had made him so popular in Yakima. It was also his ability to motivate and mentor even the most disadvantaged young men who went on to find purpose and promise as members of Gabby's various sports teams. When Morris had returned to Yakima in 1969, he and his former coach had reconnected. As adults now, rather than coach and student, they had struck up a friendship that included going hunting together, as well as going whitewater rafting, boating, and spearfishing. For Morris especially, life had changed a lot since he had graduated from high school. Despite getting that 4-year college football scholarship, Morris wound up dropping out of Washington State University and joining the Marine Corps Reserves instead. That was also when Morris and his longtime sweetheart, Deanne, who had just graduated from high school in Yakima, got married and settled down in Tacoma, a city of 109,000, perched alongside the Puget Sound on the west coast, under the shadow of the huge snow-capped mountain called Mount Rainier. But by the time Morris was honorably discharged from the Marine Corps Reserves at the age of 27, and when Deanne was 24, the young couple was ready to move back to Yakima, where they would be closer to their families. And over the next 4 years, Morris would eventually finish his degree by studying part-time at a community college 35 miles away and while working several jobs, until he landed the position he had now at Wapato Intermediate School. In the meantime, Deanne had found a good job with a local bank in Yakima, and they had 2 young children, a little boy and a little girl. And in all that time, from 1965, when Morris and Deanne had married in the Presbyterian Church in Yakima, through the years they had spent in Tacoma and their move back here to Yakima and the birth of their 2 kids, Morris had always felt like their marriage was as close to perfection as anything he'd ever known. Both he and Deanne were children of divorce. Morris had been raised from the age of 2 by his single mother, who had carved out a modest living for herself and her beloved only child as a highly trained court reporter. Deanne had come from a much wealthier family, but her parents' divorce had left her with a deep longing to find permanence and stability in a family of her own. And in Morris, the strong and gentle man she had first laid eyes on when she was just 14, Deanne was sure she had found her life partner. And in Deanne, Morris knew he had found the one and only person he would ever love. But all that would change starting in December of 1973. That's when Gabby, Morris's good friend and the coach he had admired for so many years, asked to come live with Morris and Deanne and their 2 kids. Morris had been stunned when Gabby explained that his wife of 20 years had kicked him out of the family home. To Morris, his coach's marriage had also seemed perfect. Gabby and his wife had 3 happy kids, they were financially well off, and they both shared the same passion, sports. Also, Gabby was just a total straight arrow, a complete stickler for modeling the behavior that he expected of the young men he coached. No drinking, no smoking, no drugs, and no messing around with girls. When Morris asked his former coach what had gone wrong, Gabby said that, like a lot of couples, he and his wife had just sort of drifted apart. But Gabby was sure he could win his wife back and persuade her not to file for a divorce. He just needed a place to live for a few weeks so he could pull himself together and then launch his campaign to save his marriage. Morris had not hesitated. This was the man who had inspired Morris's own decision to become a coach and physical education instructor. This was the man who had helped Morris become one of the best football players Yakima County had ever seen. And, most importantly, this man was Morris's friend, and Gabby obviously needed Morris's help. But delivering that help had been harder than Morris expected. In the end, it had taken Morris almost a month to override Deanne's objections to this plan of Morris's former coach coming to live with them. While Gabby had been one of Morris's friends, Deanne hardly even knew the 41-year-old wrestling coach, and her life was already hard enough. Money was tight, she was juggling a job and taking care of the kids. The last thing Deanne wanted was yet another person in the house that she would need to feed and clean up after. But by January of 1974, Deanne had finally agreed. Now, as Morris walked out of Wapato Intermediate School into the chilly, cloudy November afternoon, he wished he had listened to Deanne and found some other way to help his old coach. Getting into his car in the school parking lot, Morris glanced again at his watch. Deanne was working at the bank until about 6 that evening, so Morris would have the afternoon with their kids before they all ate dinner together, and then Morris headed off to his second job as a bouncer at a local tavern in Yakima called the Lion's Share. There, from 8 p.m. until 2 a.m., Morris would check IDs so the bar wouldn't be serving any underage drinkers, and Morris would also just keep the peace. It had been years since he'd played college football, but at 5 foot 11 inches tall and weighing 210 pounds, Morris was not only still in great physical shape, but he also had a patient temperament and a knack for diffusing tense situations. Not that either of those qualities had been of any use to Morris back in January of 1974, when Gabby had arrived on their doorstep with his suitcases and his charming smile. It had only taken a couple of weeks for Morris to realize that his old coach was a very different man than the one who had preached such high standards of clean living and integrity to his students. It turned out Gabby had a very serious drinking problem. But at the same time that Morris realized his coach was headed at top speed down the road to full-blown alcoholism, Deanne's objections to Gabby's presence had strangely totally vanished. Gabby was good at holding the whiskey he had started drinking by the bottleful, secretly during the day, and not so secretly at night after Deanne had gone to bed. And Gabby soon charmed Deanne by the help he offered with the kids, the sympathetic ear he offered to Deanne as she told him about the stress of never having quite enough money, how quick he was to lend a hand with laundry and grocery shopping, and the way he looked at her. Deanne had met Morris when she was 14 and when he was 17, and they had been a couple since Deanne had turned 16. By the time Gabby, the legendary local celebrity, arrived on the scene, Deanne was 27, and most of the passion and all the romance had drained out of her marriage with Morris. And even if Morris did not seem to notice at all, it was crystal clear to Deanne that Gabby found her captivating and sexy. So when Gabby taught Deanne how to drive his late-model golden brown MG sports car, and their hands happened to touch as Gabby showed her how to use the stick shift, Deanne welcomed the thrill and sense of excitement she felt. It didn't take long for Gabby to forget any plans he had made to win back his wife of 20 years. Instead, he could hardly wait for his divorce to become final. And it took Deanne just 2.5 months of knowing Gabby to trade Morris's steadfast devotion and predictability for Gabby's promises of a beautiful house in the best part of town and a daring and exciting love life. So, just halfway through April, when the Yakima County apple orchards were starting to bloom, and just 10 weeks after Gabby had first arrived on the Blankenbaker's doorstep, Deanne left her husband of 9 years and moved in with his former coach and trusted friend, Gabby. Gabby had recently left the Blankenbaker residence and got a place of his own. Deanne took Morris's 2 young children with her to the new house, where Gabby's own 3 children were regular visitors. As Morris pulled his car into the driveway of his home at 210 North 6th Street, he remembered the total shock he had felt when Deanne had told him she was leaving. Morris had been so busy working and so focused on the ways in which his old coach seemed to be falling apart in front of his eyes that he had been completely blind to the betrayal that was taking place right under his nose. Unlike Deanne, Morris had discovered why Gabby's wife had kicked Gabby out in the first place. Gabby had apparently become totally obsessed with his wife, and that obsession drove him to become paranoid that she was being unfaithful. Fed up with Gabby's accusations and his increasingly controlling behavior, his wife had ended their relationship, kicked him out of the house, and started a new life on her own. Looking back, Morris wished he had told Deanne about that side of Gabby. But at the time, given his wife's initial objections to Gabby coming and staying with them, Morris had not wanted to pile on and make his old friend look even worse in Deanne's eyes. Even through his shock and hurt when Deanne told him about her affair with Gabby, Morris couldn't help but think that Deanne's decision to leave was so impulsive and sudden that maybe someday she would change her mind and come back to him. So instead of losing his temper and destroying whatever feelings he and Deanne had left for one another, Morris had dug deep into his soul and told his wife that no matter what happened, he loved her and he would always be there for her. But once Deanne and the children had gone, Morris was totally devastated. And when Deanne and Gabby had announced they were going to get married on September 14th, 1974, just 3 months after Deanne officially divorced Morris, and just 9 months after Gabby had first moved in with the Blankenbakers, Morris promptly packed up his stuff and moved to Hawaii. 4 months later, though, Morris was back in Yakima. He just couldn't stand to be that far away from his 2 kids and from his mother Olive, who had just been through an illness serious enough that she had wound up in the hospital. Once back in town, Morris began picking up the pieces of his life. That's when he bought the 4-bedroom house at North and 6th Street and rented out rooms to some of his friends to help pay for the mortgage. And in the meantime, Deanne's storybook romance with the man who was 14 years her senior had already begun to fall apart. Once Gabby and Deanne were living together, Gabby did not try to hide his drinking. and Deanne was horrified as her new husband knocked off an entire fifth of whiskey at least 3 or 4 nights a week, sometimes locking Deanne out of the house and screaming accusations that she was seeing other men. After 3 separations from Gabby, the longest lasting 2 weeks, Deanne had had enough, and in July of 1975, 10 months after getting married to Gabby, Deanne was filing for her second divorce. And this time, when she left her dream home on the better side of Yakima, Deanne took her kids straight back to her ex-husband Morris and his much less glamorous wooden frame house on North and 6th that was separated by just a little alleyway from a hodgepodge assortment of apartments and 2 family homes. Even as Morris and Deanne made plans to remarry as soon as Deanne's divorce from Gabby was finalized, Deanne dropped Gabby's last name, trading Moore for Blankenbaker. As Morris let himself into the house he now shared again with Deanne and his 2 kids, he told himself that he should have known that his old coach, competitive to the bone, would not let Deanne go without a fight. But what neither Deanne nor Morris had expected was the intensity of Gabby's anger and jealousy when Deanne left him to go back to Morris. Just a week earlier, in mid-November, while Morris had been working at the Lion's Share, he'd received a terrified phone call from Deanne telling him that Gabby had let himself into their house through an unlocked door, and he was now at the door of the master bedroom where Deanne had been sleeping. Deanne had heard someone inside the house and had had just enough time to lock the bedroom door before Gabby arrived and started pounding on the door, begging Deanne to take him back and threatening to kick the door down. Morris had grabbed one of his good friends who was at the tavern, and the 2 of them jumped into Morris's car and they drove at high speed from the Lion's Share back to Morris's house. There, they found Gabby, completely drunk, staggering around the outside of the Blankenbaker home, pounding on the downstairs windows, waving a gun, and threatening to kill himself or Morris. The friend that Morris had brought with him from the Lion's Share, Joey Watkins, another former student of Coach Gabby's, expected a fight between these 2 men. He was also stunned at the change in his former coach, who had always lectured everyone about self-control and the importance of staying away from alcohol. But instead of busting Gabby in the mouth, Morris went up to his old coach and talked to him quietly, getting him to stow the gun, get back into his car, and go back to the apartment that Gabby now shared with his 16-year-old son, Mike. To Joey, Morris had just shrugged his shoulders and said, "I could have hit him, but he was my coach too. I just can't do it." There was also another bond between Morris and Coach Gabby. Morris had once saved his coach's life. On one of the river trips that Gabby and Morris used to take together, their boat had capsized and both men had been pulled underwater by a deep current. Morris made it to the surface, but Gabby had been caught underwater in a tangle of vines and roots near the Yakima riverbank. Always an excellent swimmer, Morris had managed to dive down and free Gabby's legs and bring his former coach safely back to land, where Gabby coughed up the water in his lungs that had come so close to killing him. This event was yet another reason why Gabby's later betrayal in starting an affair with Morris's wife had hurt Morris so deeply. But it had also given Morris a sense that on some level he had assumed a kind of responsibility for this man, whose life was so obviously coming completely undone. And besides, not long after that night when Morris had confronted Gabby out in the yard, it seemed like Gabby had finally gotten the message and was leaving Morris and Deanne alone. Starting on November 18th, neither Morris nor Deanne had seen or heard from Gabby. And that was when Deanne and Morris had finally begun to feel that both the turmoil and the gossip around Deanne divorcing 2 different husbands in less than a year and a half was actually over. With that final thought, Morris turned his full attention back to his children. And by the time Deanne arrived home from work at around 6:30 on the evening of November 21st, the whole family was ready to go out for Friday night pizza at Shakey's restaurant before Morris headed off to his night shift at the Lion's Share. At 5 a.m. the next morning, November 22nd, Deanne suddenly woke up feeling totally alarmed. She realized even before her eyes had adjusted to the dark that Morris was not in bed next to her. Getting out of bed and pulling on her bathrobe, Deanne hustled down the stairs and stepped out onto the front porch of the house to see if her husband's car was outside. And it was. Morris always parked at the end of their driveway that sort of wrapped around the back of the house, and so Deanne had walked over to the far side of their front porch and looked back in that direction, and she saw his car. Wondering if her husband had just fallen asleep in his car after coming home very late from his shift at the Lion's Share, Deanne walked down the porch steps and took a left and walked around the house towards the back, where she peered inside of her husband's car, but Morris was not inside. Puzzled, Deanne retraced her steps back to the front of the house, and then after going inside, she put on her contact lenses and then began searching every room of the house for Morris. But after searching every room, it was clear Morris was not inside. So, grabbing the collar of the family dog, Deanne went back outside, and this time, after going down the front porch steps onto the front lawn, she turned right and walked around that side of the house to reach the backyard. This side of the house, which was the left side if you were facing the house from the street, butted up against an alleyway. This alleyway was only separated from the house's property by a flimsy, short chicken wire fence, a barrier that was more psychological than physical. Between that chicken wire fence and the side of the house was a narrow stretch of grass that ran from the front yard straight back to the backyard. So after Deanne turned the corner and started walking down that stretch of grass, she suddenly stopped, because there, on the ground, near the open gate that separated the front yard from the backyard, was the figure of a man lying face down on the grass. A moment later, two neighbors who were waiting on the curb outside their nearby apartments to catch their rides to go out duck hunting heard a woman's frantic screams from across the alley. "Morris! Morris! Oh my God, he's dead!" By 5:25 a.m., Yakima police and medical personnel had already started arriving at the scene, lining up out front of the house on 210 North and 6th Street. And even before Yakima's chief homicide detective, Robert Brimmer, arrived 15 minutes later, first responders already knew three things. One, the dead man laid out on the grass under the first thin layer of falling snow was Yakima's popular intermediate school coach, 32-year-old Morris Blankenbaker. Two, given the stiffness of the body, Morris must have been killed hours before Deanne had dialed 911. And three, the obvious cause of Morris's death was gunshot wounds. By the time Sergeant Brimmer pulled up, officers were already surrounding the Blankenbaker property with yellow crime scene tape, and Deanne was inside the house with her wide-eyed children crying hysterically. Using flashlights, police officers searched every inch of the south side of the house where Morris's body had been discovered, hoping that the flashlight beams might glint off the shiny metal of a shell casing buried in the 3 to 4 inch deep grass. They also searched the nearby alleyway and all the trash barrels in case the killer had thrown the murder weapon into one of them. But all police found at the crime scene was a mostly empty bottle of beer that Morris had probably been carrying in his hand when he got out of his car. By 8:30 a.m., Morris's body had been taken to the county morgue, where an autopsy would be performed at 7 p.m. that night, and Detective Brimmer and his investigators were at the Yakima police station and fanning out through the Blankenbaker's neighborhood, interviewing witnesses and putting together a list of possible suspects. In most murders, the victim's spouse is at the top of that list, but it didn't take detectives long to rule Deanne out as a suspect. There was no trace of gun residue on her hands or clothing. Morris did not have a life insurance policy that might have given Deanne a financial motive for murder, and as the whole town knew, Deanne had just recently reconciled with Morris, and the two were planning to remarry. But what Deanne did have for police was the name of the man she was certain had to be behind Morris's death, and that was Morris's one-time friend and mentor, Gabby Moore, the man Deanne herself had only recently divorced. Deanne wasted no time telling Detective Brimmer about the incident just the week before, when the coach had shown up with a gun one night when Morris was working at the tavern, and how Gabby had entered the Blankenbaker house and threatened to break down the door to her bedroom. Deanne also told them about the harassing phone calls Gabby had made to their house almost every day, and Gabby's attempts to get his children and Deanne's own sister to try to pressure and guilt-trip Deanne into going back to Gabby. But even after hearing these details about what sounded like Gabby's obsession with winning back Deanne, Detective Brimmer just could not believe that Gabby, who literally owed his life to Morris, would have just walked up to Morris and shot him in cold blood. But lacking any other obvious suspects and having no evidence from the crime scene that provided police with any other leads in the case, Detective Brimmer picked up the phone and called Gabby, asking him to come to the police station and bring along any firearms he owned. Coach Gabby did come to the police station that Saturday afternoon, but he brought along an attorney, and he had nothing he wanted to say to police, except to point out that he could not possibly have committed this murder since he had been in the hospital from November 18th until hours after Morris's body had been discovered. It would turn out that the peaceful interlude that Morris and Deanne had enjoyed for the last few days when Gabby had finally seemed ready to leave them alone, it was actually just the result of Gabby experiencing such stress-related high blood pressure that his doctor had ordered Gabby into the hospital for treatment and observation. And after interviewing hospital and nursing staff, and even checking the windows and doors of the hospital for any possible way that Gabby might have slipped out to commit the murder, investigators would confirm Gabby's alibi. Over the next 3 weeks, police worked every possible lead and motive in the homicide case. They investigated any arguments Morris may have had with customers at the Lion's Share, arguments he might have had with parents, with students, or other teachers at the middle school where Morris worked, and every single one of those avenues led nowhere. Meanwhile, now that Gabby was out of the hospital, he picked up right where he had left off, trying to win Deanne back. He called her almost every day, and any time one of Gabby's friends or a student on one of his teams or a fellow coach or teacher stopped by to visit, the coach seemed oblivious to Morris's murder. Instead, all he could talk about was how much he missed Deanne and how much he wanted and needed her back. By early December, Gabby's drinking had gotten so bad that even the efforts of his assistant coach to cover for Gabby's failure to show up for practices and even meets were just not enough. Despite the awards and acclaim that Gabby's outstanding talents as a coach and mentor had brought to Yakima County, and to so many young men who had Gabby to thank for college sports scholarships, Yakima school administrators informed Gabby that they would be ending his teaching contract at the end of that school year. But even this blow to Gabby's ego and his reputation hardly seemed to register, because there was something else now worrying Coach Gabby, and this time he didn't call his lawyer before talking to Detective Brimmer. According to Gabby, someone was now threatening his life. The coach told police that he had received a phone call from someone whose voice he didn't recognize, telling the coach, "I got Morris, and I'm gonna get you next." But despite these reports, and despite Gabby's airtight alibi for the time of Morris's murder, there was one detective who just couldn't shake the feeling that the coach had to have been involved in some way in Morris's murder, and that Gabby was now making up these threats to direct police attention away from himself. And that detective was Morris's best friend, Vern Henderson. Vern and Morris had gone to high school together, and they had both been Coach Gabby's protégés. But while Gabby had never made it into professional football, Vern had realized his dream of becoming a cop. And on the day that Morris had been found murdered, 32-year-old Vern Henderson had sworn to Morris's mother, Olive, that Vern would find her son's killer. So, in those weeks after his best friend's death, Detective Henderson had started casually chatting up some of Gabby's current and former team members, hoping that someone might have heard or seen something, anything, that might connect Gabby to Morris's murder. But then, at about 1 a.m. on December 25th, 1975, early Christmas morning, Yakima police received a 911 call that turned Detective Henderson's theory and Deanne's suspicions about Coach Gabby upside down. At about 8 p.m. on Christmas Eve, Coach Gabby's 16-year-old son, Mike, said goodbye to his father before leaving to join his girlfriend's family for a Christmas Eve dinner. Mike had done his best to cheer his father up that day, and even Gabby's first ex-wife had come over to the apartment Gabby and Mike shared to clean and vacuum and wash the stack of dirty dishes piling up in the sink. And later that evening, right through to 12:15 a.m., Other people who cared about Gabby, his daughter and the same doctor who had ordered Gabby into the hospital just a month ago, all called to check in and see how Gabby was managing over the holidays. Gabby, who was an expert at covering up just how much he was drinking, had told them he was doing okay and that he wasn't completely alone since he expected more members of his wrestling teams to come by and visit. It wasn't until 1 a.m. on Christmas Day, December 25th, when Mike and his girlfriend came back to Gabby's apartment, that anyone realized Gabby was anything but okay. The first sign of trouble was the fact that the back door into Gabby's kitchen was propped wide open, and when Mike walked through that door, he saw his father's body lying sprawled between the kitchen and living rooms. Gabby was face down and not moving. Despite the fact that there was a .22 caliber shell casing lying about 2 feet away from Gabby's body, there was no blood anywhere and no sign of a struggle. It wasn't until the medics who answered Mike's 911 call put Gabby's body onto a stretcher that they realized that Gabby had not died of a heart attack or other natural causes. Because as soon as they had turned Gabby over, blood began pouring out of a bullet hole just under his left armpit. An autopsy would later reveal that a small caliber bullet that matched the shell casing found near Gabby's body, as well as the bullets that had killed Morris Blankenbaker 1 month earlier, had entered somewhere under Coach's shoulder, ricocheted off of his fourth rib, and torn across the inside of his chest, ripping through his heart and both lungs. By the time the medics arrived, 6 pints of blood had collected in Gabby's chest cavity, and as soon as his body was moved, that blood, more than half of all the blood in Gabby's body, started draining out, quickly soaking the small throw rug under the coach's chest. Suddenly, Detective Brimmer and Fern Henderson realized that Gabby's reports that he was being threatened had likely been true. On the day after Christmas, Yakima residents woke up to yet another shocking front-page headline. Quote, "Tied to Blankenbaker slaying? Davis wrestling coach shot, killed." End quote. Meanwhile, Detectives Brimmer and Henderson didn't need reporters to tell them that the murders of the city's 2 coaches, both recently married to the same woman and both shot with the same .22 caliber handgun, had to be related. And the first person they wanted to talk to was Deanne. Even if Deanne did not kill Morris, maybe she was so convinced that Gabby had a hand in that murder that she shot Gabby out of hatred and revenge. They also wondered if maybe Deanne had yet a third admirer, another person so obsessed with wanting her that they would kill both Morris and Gabby. But within 48 hours, detectives were back to square one. Not only did Deanne deny any involvement in Gabby's murder and the existence of some third mystery lover, she had an airtight alibi for the time of Gabby's murder. She and her children had spent all of Christmas Eve and Christmas Day with family. And as far as anyone knew, the only 2 serious relationships Deanne had had since the age of 16 were with Morris and Gabby. Now investigators were back to their original theory that revolved around a single killer who may or may not have been known and trusted by both victims. Maybe this person had surprised Morris so completely that Morris never even tried to fight off the shooter. As for Gabby, the autopsy showed that at the time of death, he had 3 times the legal limit of alcohol in his bloodstream, which means he probably would have been too drunk to defend himself from an attacker. Frustrated and baffled, Detective Henderson turned once again to the people who were among the last to see Gabby alive. That group included several members of the coach's so-called wrestling posse, who were a combination of current and former student athletes who had stopped in to visit Gabby on Christmas Eve. According to the boys from this posse, once they were at Gabby's place, they had tried to convince Gabby to come out with them and have some fun. But Gabby had repeatedly said no, he was going to stay put. And so by 12:15 a.m., Gabby's posse gave up and they left, leaving Gabby all alone in his apartment, sitting in his favorite chair, listening to sad love songs. It would not be until Monday, February 23rd, 1976, 3 months after Morris was gunned down outside of his house, and 2 months after Gabby was murdered, that police received the tip that would break the double homicide investigation wide open. 2 days earlier, 2 teenage brothers out fishing off a small island under the twin bridges that crossed the Natchez River had made a totally unexpected discovery. lying on the bank of that island in about 3 inches of water, the boys had found a rusty, older model .22 caliber automatic pistol with a long barrel. By Monday, their father was standing in Detective Brimmer's office. When the man placed the gun down on the investigator's desk, Detective Brimmer knew immediately that he must be staring at the weapon that had been used to murder both Morris and Gabby. That same day, the Yakima Herald-Republic newspaper reported that a gun had been found in the Natchez River. A few days later, Yakima law enforcement got a visit from the person who claimed not only to own that gun, but who also knew how the gun had turned up in the Natchez River and why. Based on that new information and follow-up interviews conducted by Detectives Brimmer and Henderson and other investigators, here is a reconstruction of what happened on the night Morris Blankenbaker was killed and the night 1 month later when Gabby Moore was also shot to death inside of his apartment. It would turn out that Coach Gabby had spent a lot of time talking to a lot of people about how horrible his life had become since Deanne had left him to go back to her first husband, Morris Blankenbaker. And one of those people was listening very carefully to what Gabby had to say. After this person approached Gabby and asked if there was any way to help, Gabby said, actually, yes, there is a way. And by mid-November, Gabby had outlined for this person an entire plan that he felt sure would result in Deanne taking him back. And on the evening of November 21st, when Gabby was in the hospital being treated for the repeated nosebleeds that were a result of his high blood pressure, he decided to put this plan into action. At about 7 p.m., the coach got out of his hospital bed and walked down the corridor to the payphone near the visitor's lobby. He placed one call and then went straight back to his room. 7 hours later, Morris arrived home from his shift as a bouncer at the Lion's Share Tavern. After parking his car in its usual place on the driveway behind his house, Morris sat in the driver's seat for a few minutes, enjoying the bottle of beer that he'd brought with him from work. Looking up at the upstairs windows of his house, he thought of the Thanksgiving that he and Deanne would share together with their kids next week. Suddenly, he was just eager to get inside and slip into bed and hold Deanne tightly in his arms. So he turned off the engine and dropped the car keys onto the floor in front of the passenger seat, and then he got out and closed the driver's side door behind him and began walking toward the front of the house. To get there, he walked alongside the south side of the house, the same side of the house that was closest to that alleyway separated from his property only by a short chicken wire fence. When Morris reached the little gate on his property on the south side of his house that separated his backyard from his front yard, he was about to walk through that gate when he heard a voice off to his right somewhere in the alleyway calling out his name. Morris stopped where he was and turned with the beer bottle still in his hand and stared out at the alleyway to see if someone was actually there or if he had just imagined someone calling his name. But sure enough, when he looked at the alleyway, standing there was someone he knew well. Before Morris could react to them, this person told Morris that they had actually just run out of gas, and they gestured toward the end of the alleyway, kind of beckoning Morris to come over and help them. As Morris stepped closer to the chicken wire fence to look down the alleyway toward this person's car, the person in the alleyway raised a hidden pistol, aimed it directly at Morris's face, and fired. The first bullet hit Morris just above his front teeth, and the force of the bullet spun him sideways as he fell to the ground. The second two bullets came in quick succession, hitting Morris just behind his left ear. Without saying another word, Morris's killer turned and ran down the alleyway out of sight. One of the Blankenbaker's neighbors would later tell police that at about 2:10 a.m. on November 22nd, she'd heard what she thought were firecrackers and then the sound of someone in heavy shoes running past her ground floor window. 1 month later, and Gabby was more desperate than ever. His plan to eliminate his rival, Morris, had succeeded, but instead of delivering Deanne back into Gabby's arms, Deanne wanted nothing to do with Gabby. And despite his alibi, Deanne kept telling police that she believed Gabby must have been involved in Morris's murder. And neither Deanne nor investigators seemed to take Gabby's story about him being threatened by the supposed killer all that seriously. So Gabby hatched another, even more complicated plan. And in the first hour of Christmas morning, Gabby was ready to put that plan into effect. By that time, in the first hour of Christmas morning, all the student wrestlers who had dropped by to check on Gabby and to see if he wanted to go out with them that night, the so-called wrestling posse, they had gone. But Gabby knew that one of his visitors would come back. And when that person did arrive, everything would be in place, and Gabby himself would be physically ready for what lay ahead. He had actually been preparing for this moment all evening, all by steadily drinking so much alcohol that he was sure he would hardly feel any pain from what was about to happen. When Gabby's visitor arrived at the coach's house a few minutes later, the two men talked briefly to one another, and then Gabby made his final preparations. Taking the telephone receiver off its hook, he placed it on the living room floor so that it would be easier to reach when he needed to dial 911. And then he went over the plan one more time with Morris's killer, telling him exactly where to aim so when the bullet hit Gabby in the shoulder, it would pass right through him without hitting any critical organs. Gabby was sure that once the public discovered that he himself had been the victim of attempted murder, the police and Deanne would no longer suspect him in Morris's murder. And Gabby was sure that seeing how close he had come to death would reawaken Deanne's love for him. And then, finally, Gabby maneuvered his body into place. Getting down on his hands and knees on the floor, he assumed a wrestling position known as the referee position. And when the gunman, the most brilliant high school wrestler Gabby Moore had ever coached, just stood there, maybe 7 feet away from Gabby, looking like he might refuse to go through with this after all, Gabby turned to look at him and started repeating one word over and over again. Shoot, shoot, shoot. But just as the young man raised the pistol and finally pulled the trigger, Gabby, too drunk to hold the referee position, lost his balance and started to fall to the side, exposing the area under his left armpit. And instead of the bullet passing cleanly through Gabby's shoulder, the small .22 caliber round ricocheted off one of his ribs and started tumbling through his chest cavity, literally ripping apart his lungs and his heart. It wouldn't be until he heard the news report on Christmas Day that Gabby's accomplice would realize that instead of wounding his coach as planned, the single bullet the young man had fired had actually killed his beloved mentor and friend. It would turn out that the man who killed both Morris and Gabby was Gabby's assistant wrestling coach, a 22-year-old college student named Angelo Pleasant, who went by the nickname Tuffy. Early in the summer of 1975, Tuffy had come back to Yakima to ask his former high school coach if Gabby could help him get the extra credits Tuffy needed in order to get his degree in physical education at Central Washington College in nearby Ellensburg. Gabby was more than happy to pull some strings and offer Tuffy a job as Gabby's assistant wrestling coach. Tuffy, who worshipped his former coach, was deeply upset by the obvious distress Gabby felt over the loss of Deanne. Although he wanted to help Gabby and even asked Gabby, what can I do? It wasn't until his coach threatened to fire Tuffy from his assistant coaching position, something that would mean the end of Tuffy's college career, that Tuffy finally agreed to Gabby's plan to eliminate Morris Blankenbaker as a way for Gabby to get Deanne back. Tuffy agreed to this despite Morris being one of his friends who he had known for years. And when Tuffy later refused to cooperate with Gabby's plan to have Tuffy shoot and just wound Gabby, Gabby threatened to tell police that Tuffy had murdered Morris. In a confession to police on February 28th, Tuffy described how he had felt backed into a corner with no choice but to carry out Gabby's plan. And when Tuffy left Gabby's apartment shortly after midnight on Christmas Day, he had no idea that instead of just wounding Gabby, Tuffy had accidentally killed him. Tuffy didn't even pause after firing that fatal shot. Instead, he had immediately ran out of the apartment and gone to his cousin's house to return the .22 caliber automatic pistol to her. When Tuffy's cousin, Loretta Scott, read about Gabby's death in the newspaper a few hours later, she panicked. She worried that Tuffy may have used her gun to commit these two homicides that were now obviously linked through this gun, and that gun would be traced back to her. So, on December 26, 1975, the day after Christmas, Loretta and her brother drove to the Twin Bridges over the Natchez River and threw the pistol into the water. They had no way of knowing that instead of the gun sinking to the bottom of the river, where it never would have been found, the gun landed on a small island temporarily submerged by the runoff from winter snow and rain. But 2 months later, when Loretta read that short article in the Yakima Herald-Republic reporting that a gun had been found under the bridge in the Natchez River, Loretta decided it was time to go to police and tell them everything she knew. On August 29, 1976, Angelo Tuffy Pleasant was convicted of first-degree murder in the premeditated death of Morris Blankenbaker and sentenced to life in prison. Tuffy was also convicted of second-degree murder for the unintentional death of his coach, Gabby Moore, and sentenced to an additional 20 years in prison. But despite these lengthy sentence terms, Tuffy was released from prison in 1996. On April 18, 1976, 5 months after the murder of her first husband, Morris, and 4 months after the murder of her second husband, Gabby, Deanne Blankenbaker Moore would get married for a third time. This time, the petite brunette with the big dark eyes and soft voice would choose one of the pallbearers who had helped carry Morris's casket down the church aisle at Morris's funeral service less than a half a year earlier. 7 years younger than Deanne, Deanne's new husband would go on to become a successful business person, and Deanne would go on to become a successful stockbroker. Thanks again to the late crime writer Anne Rule, whose 1996 book, Fever in the Heart, helped us to create this podcast. Other sources for this episode include contemporary newspaper articles, documentaries, official records, and magazine art. In mid-August 2013, Mike and Karen Laspisa helped their beloved only child, 19-year-old Bryce Laspisa, get all of his things packed up and into the family car. Bryce had just spent the summer with his parents in their home in Laguna Niguel, California, which is one of the nicest places to live in the entire country. But now that the summer was coming to an end, it was time for Bryce to head back to Sierra College in Rocklin, California, where he was set to start his sophomore year. Once all of his things were packed inside the trunk of the car, all three of them hopped inside and then made the 7-hour drive north to his campus. Once his parents had moved him into his apartment, they gave him a hug and a kiss and wished him luck, and then they left. On their ride back home, Mike and Karen talked about how well their son seemed to be doing. He loved his school, he loved the program he was in graphic design, he was a very gifted artist, he had lots of friends, he had a wonderful girlfriend. It just seemed like he was living his best life and he was on the path to success. So nothing could prepare them for what their son did 2 weeks later. Just a couple of days after getting dropped off at school, Bryce's very close friend and roommate, Sean, and Bryce's girlfriend, Kim, noticed Bryce was acting erratically. Specifically, he was drinking a ton of hard alcohol. Now, Bryce was no saint. He liked to drink and party like many other kids his age did, but the amount of alcohol he was consuming was concerning. Also, Bryce began experimenting with a drug called Vyvanse, which is a very powerful stimulant that's normally used to treat attention deficit disorder. Now, Bryce didn't have attention deficit disorder. He was taking it in order to stay up late at night and play video games. But between the heavy drinking and the drug use, it seemed like Bryce's personality was starting to change. He was becoming anxious and skittish and kind of paranoid. And so finally, Sean and Kim confronted him about his substance abuse and asked him, what's going on? What's causing you to act this way? And Bryce would say, nothing, guys, I'm fine. I'm just, drinking and doing whatever I want to do. It's not a big deal. But Sean and Kim, they weren't buying it. They were convinced that something bad had happened to Bryce, and the way he was coping with it was by drinking really heavily and taking this drug. On August 28th, so about 2 weeks after Bryce has been dropped back off at school by his parents, Bryce and his roommate Sean were alone in their apartment together. And at some point, as they're sitting there just kind of minding their own business, Bryce says to Sean, hey, I want to give you something. And he takes his diamond earrings out and he gives them to Sean. And Sean's looking at these earrings and he's like, didn't your mom give these to you? Aren't these important to you? These are expensive. And Bryce just says, no, I want you to have them. And so Sean is looking at these earrings, looking back at Bryce, wondering what's going on here. And then before he can even refuse the gift, Bryce is grabbing his Xbox and putting it on the table and telling Sean, I want you to have this too. Take my Xbox. And so Sean is like, I can't accept these two things. These are expensive. These are valuable to you. what's going on here? But Bryce would just say, look, man, I want you to have these things. You're important to me and I want to give these to you. And so as Sean is sitting there wondering how to handle this very strange offering, he watched Bryce pull his phone out and begin really aggressively texting somebody. And then after a while, Bryce looks up from his phone and he tells Sean, hey, just so you know, I broke up with Kim. At this point, Sean knows, okay, something is definitely wrong here. There's no reason Bryce would break up with Kim. They were such a loving couple. They doted on each other. They were very close. They had just seen each other earlier in the day. Nothing seemed to be wrong. And so now Bryce is text breaking up with her. It didn't make any sense. Plus, Bryce is now trying to give him all these valuable things. It just wasn't really adding up. And so Sean decided he needed to get in touch with Bryce's parents because clearly someone needed to intervene. And so Sean waited until Bryce left. Bryce actually left to go talk to Kim. And at that point, Sean got his phone out and he looked up Bryce's parents and he called them. Bryce's mother, Karen, she picks up the phone and Sean explains that, your son, he's acting strangely. He's abusing drugs and alcohol. And I wouldn't be doing this unless I thought there was a problem. Like, I'm not trying to get him in trouble. I want you to reach out to him and see what's going on because I think there's a problem. And so Karen was alarmed by this. She had no idea any of this was going on. And she says, okay, I'll reach out to my son. Thank you for telling me. And so they hang up. And before Karen can even call Bryce is calling her. And so Karen answers the phone, but it's not Bryce. It's Kim, his now ex-girlfriend. And she says to Karen, hey, I'm sorry to just call you like this, but your son, he just showed up at my apartment and he's acting so strangely that I actually took his keys. I don't want him to drive. There's something wrong with him. It's hard to describe, but he just seems totally off. And so now Karen's really concerned because just seconds ago, Sean has told her basically the same thing. And so Karen asks Kim, will you please put my son on the phone? Bryce picks up the phone and he says, hey, Mom, and he sounds totally normal. And she asks him, what's going on? I keep hearing that you're acting strangely and, what are you doing over at Kim's apartment? What's going on here? And Bryce would tell his mom that, look, Mom, I just broke up with Kim. It's a very messy breakup. That's why she's calling you. She's upset. And, that's why I'm over here. We're talking about it. And look, at this point, I just really want to go home. I want to go back to my apartment, but she has my keys. Can you please tell her to give me my car keys back so I can leave? But Karen wasn't really buying it. She knew her son really well. And it just seemed totally strange that two of his very close friends in his inner circle would say the same thing independent of one another. And so she says, you know what, Bryce, look, I want you to just stay there and I'm going to fly out there first thing tomorrow morning and I'm going to just see what's going on out there. And at this, Bryce immediately says, no, Mom, I have a lot to talk to you about. And until I talk to you about it, I don't want you coming out here. And so Karen's like, what do you mean you have a lot to talk to me about? What is it that you have to talk to me about? I don't really understand. But Bryce refused to elaborate over the phone, which Karen thought was very odd because Bryce was remarkably forthcoming with his parents. They had a very open relationship. They were very honest with each other. So for him to not even give a hint at whatever it was that was on his mind that in some way had to do with what was going on here, it just seemed very odd and unnecessarily cryptic. And so Karen gave up trying to get more information out of her son, and instead she put her husband on the phone and he asked Bryce, hey, what's going on here? Are you okay? Your mom tells me there's some problem. Like, what's going on here? And Bryce again just reiterates, look, Dad, I just broke up with my girlfriend. That's all that's going on here. There's no need to be concerned. I just need one of you to tell Kim to give me my keys back so I can go back to my apartment. That's all I need right now. And so Mike felt convinced that his son was totally fine, even though it did seem odd that two of his friends had said he was acting erratically. But from Mike's perspective, Bryce seemed just fine. And so he said as much to Karen and thought, let's just get Kim to give him his keys back and he can go back to his apartment and we can talk to him later about whatever it is that's going on. And so reluctantly, Karen gets back on the phone and she asks to speak with Kim. And she says, hey, Kim, would you mind giving our son his keys back? He'd like to leave. And so Kim says, okay, I'll give him his keys. And then they hung up. And then Kim got the keys out. She gave them to Bryce and Bryce left. At about 11:30 p.m. that night, Bryce was in his car. He was getting ready to leave when his mom called him back and said, okay, look, I want you to go home, but as soon as you get there, just give me a call so I know you're safe. And Bryce said, no problem, I'll give you a call. About an hour and a half later at 1 a.m., Bryce called his mom back to let her know that he was home safe at his apartment, and Karen and Mike are totally relieved, and they tell their son, okay, we'll talk to you tomorrow morning. 10 hours later at 11 a.m. on August 29th, Karen received an automated phone call from her car
car insurance company, letting her know that roadside assistance had been used on their 2003 Toyota Highlander car. That was Bryce's car. And so Karen's totally confused because the last she spoke to her son, he was at his apartment. He was home safe. He did not have any car problems. And so she's thinking, did he get up early this morning and get into an accident and call roadside assistance? Or maybe last night he got into car problems and just didn't tell her about it, but they were minor. And so she calls Bryce, but Bryce doesn't pick up. And so she dials his roommate, Sean. Sean does answer the phone and she says, hey, would you mind putting Bryce on the line? But Sean says, Bryce isn't here and he didn't come home last night. Considering the general weirdness around their son's recent behavior, this really shocked Karen and Mike. At first, they thought we need to call the police because something horrible has happened. But then they thought, well, wait a minute, let's go into his bank statements because he has a credit card that we gave him. And let's see if there's any recent purchases that will allow us to track where he is. And so they pull up his bank statements and his most recent charge was only a few hours earlier. And it was at a car repair shop in Buttonwillow, California, which is this small desert town right off of the I-5 highway, located about halfway between his school campus and their hometown in Laguna Niguel. And so Karen and Mike assume their son last night must not have gone to his apartment, but instead just kept on driving south in an attempt to drive all the way back home to his hometown of Laguna Niguel. I mean, after all, he did tell his mom he had a lot to talk about and he didn't want to talk about it on the phone. And so they assumed he must be driving here to talk about whatever it was in person. And perhaps he ran into some car problems in Buttonwillow, California. That's why he pulled over. That's why there's this charge at this auto repair shop. And so Karen calls the auto repair shop in Buttonwillow, and a man who worked there named Christian answered the phone. And so Karen asked him, have you seen my son? He's got red hair. He's got a tattoo on his arm. He's driving a 2003 Toyota Highlander. And Christian says, oh yeah, we saw him a couple of hours ago. We responded to his roadside assistance call. He ran out of gas on the I-5 highway. He pulled into a rest stop and we drove to that rest stop and we gave him gas. And so Karen asked Christian, did my son indicate where he was going next? And Christian said, no, he didn't. We just gave him the gas and then we left. But if you'd like, I'd be more than happy to just drive over to the rest stop. It's only about 15 minutes away and see if he's still there. It's unlikely because it's been a couple of hours, but maybe. And Karen and Mike are like, oh my gosh, thank you so much. Would you do that? That would be great. And so Christian hops in his car and he drives the 15 minutes over to this rest stop. And he's not really expecting to see Bryce in this parking lot. It had been almost 3 hours. But he pulls into the lot and there is the 2003 Toyota Highlander with Bryce sitting inside of it. He's just sitting behind the wheel staring out into nothingness. And so Christian walks up to the driver's side and he looks down to get Bryce's attention, and Bryce kind of snaps out of it and looks up and he's surprised to see Christian again. He rolls the window down and Christian says to him, hey, I just talked to your parents. They're really concerned about you. You got to talk to them. And so Christian actually pulls out his phone and he calls Karen and says, hey, he is still here. Here he is. And he hands the phone to Bryce. And as soon as Bryce puts the phone to his ear and he says hello, Karen's like, what are you doing? What are you doing just sitting in this rest stop in the middle of Buttonwillow, California? We're so worried about you. And Bryce didn't really have an answer. He just kept telling his mom, oh, I'm not doing anything. I'm just sitting here. And so finally, his mom stops trying to get information from him and just says, look, please just fill your car up with gas and come straight home, please. And Bryce says, okay, yeah, that's what I'll do. I'll do that right now. And so Bryce hands the phone back to Christian. Christian pulls it up to his ear and he says, hey, Karen, it looks like he's leaving now, so I'm going to take off. Karen thanks him and they hang up. Christian goes back into his car. He leaves the lot, and as he's driving, he looks over at Bryce, and it didn't really look like Bryce was getting ready to leave. It looked like he had just gone back to sitting and blankly staring out of his car. But Christian figured, you know what? He just talked to his mom. He said he was going to go home. I'm sure that's what he's going to do. The drive from Buttonwillow, California, south to Laguna Niguel, California, where Bryce's parents were, was about a 3-hour trip. And so the Los Pisos were expecting their son to arrive around 3 p.m. By 3:30 p.m., when he still hadn't shown up and he still hadn't called, Karen began calling her son, but he wasn't answering the phone. And as much as Karen and Mike wanted to believe their son had just gotten stuck in traffic or something like that, they knew deep down something was wrong. Something was off about his behavior. They just didn't understand what it was. For the next several hours, they continuously tried calling their son, and he never answered the phone. And so finally, by 6 p.m. that night, when he still hadn't shown up and they still couldn't get in touch with him, they called the police and they filed an official missing person report. The police began their search by contacting Bryce's cell phone provider, AT&T, and they asked them to use their cell phone towers to ping Bryce's cell phone, basically triangulate where his phone is located. And once they did that and they had the actual location of his phone, The police and Bryce's parents were shocked at where it was. It was still in Buttonwillow, California. It was located just a couple of miles down the road from that rest stop where Christian had last seen Bryce. It was now in this parking lot of this hotel. And so the police around Buttonwillow were alerted to the fact that Bryce was a missing person and his phone was apparently in this parking lot. And so police were sent over there to see if Bryce was there too. And so the police arrive in this hotel parking lot, and sure enough, right in the middle is the 2003 Toyota Highlander with Bryce sitting behind the wheel, just sitting there staring out the front. And so an officer walks up and he knocks on the glass, and Bryce rolls the window down. And the officer would say Bryce acted totally normally. He was friendly, he was lucid, he answered all their questions. When he got out of the car and they conducted field sobriety tests, he passed all of them. He even said, hey, if you want to search my car, go for it. I'm not doing anything out here. And so the officers did search his car, and there were no drugs, no alcohol. There was nothing suspicious in his car. And when they asked him, what are you doing out here? Your parents are so concerned about you. Bryce would tell them that he was just sitting there. He didn't really have much of an answer, but he told them he planned on going home soon. And so one of the officers said to him, hey, you really need to call your mom. You need to call home and let them know that you're okay. And when they told him to do that, Bryce suddenly became really apprehensive, like he did not want to call home. And the officer picked up on it. And he said, hey, you gotta tell your family what's going on. They're the reason we're out here. They're concerned about you. So get out your phone and dial your mom. And so Bryce reluctantly pulled his phone out. He dialed his mother's number and he hit call. And the officer said, give me the phone. So Bryce hands over the phone. The officer picks it up. Karen answers the phone. And the officer tells her, hey, look, I'm with your son. He's just fine. He's sober. There's no drugs. There's no alcohol. I don't really know what he's doing, but he says he's going to go home pretty soon. But there's nothing wrong about the situation that I can tell. You need to talk to your son and figure out what's going on. And so he hands the phone over to Bryce. Bryce picks it up, and Karen says to him, what's going on? Why are you still in Buttonwillow? It's been like 9 hours. And Bryce really didn't give her an answer to any of her questions. He just kind of deflected all of them and said he'd be home soon and don't worry about it. I'm just sitting here. There's nothing to worry about. And so finally, Karen just stopped trying to pull information out of her son. She could tell that, again, he was not going to tell her what's going on. And so she changed her tactic, and she told her son very gently, Bryce, please just go get a bite to eat, get a cup of coffee, kind of get yourself together here, and then please just drive home. It's only a few hours away. Drive home and we can talk about whatever problems you have, but you just gotta drive home. You gotta leave Buttonwillow. You gotta come home. And at this, Bryce says to his mom, you know what? Okay, I'm sorry. I'll be home in a few hours. And so they hang up, and the officer, who was kind of eavesdropping intentionally on this conversation to make sure everything was fine, the officer was satisfied that everything was fine, that Bryce was sober, that he would head home. And so he says, okay, Bryce, best of luck, head home to your parents. And the officer left. An hour later, Karen received a call from Christian, the car repairman who had checked on Bryce earlier. And he was actually returning one of Karen's calls. She'd called him sometime and he didn't get back to her. And so he was calling back, and he wanted to know, had Bryce made it home safely? Because now it's been several hours from when he saw him last. And Karen would tell Christian, actually, no, after you left, my son did not leave Buttonwillow. He just went down the road to a parking lot, but the police actually were just over there. They checked on him, and now I'm certain he's making his way home. Christian, who felt kind of invested in what was happening with Bryce, would say to Karen, hey, I don't mind driving over there and just confirming he has left this parking lot. But Karen would say, you know what? I'm confident he's on his way. Don't worry about it. You're too kind. So they hang up, and afterwards, Christian, even though he didn't have to, he decides, I'm going to go over there and make sure Bryce really has left, because obviously something strange is going on here. And, if there is some problem, maybe I can assist. And so he drives over to this hotel parking lot, and he really was not expecting to see Bryce there. But he pulls into the lot, and who's still in the middle of the lot but Bryce in his 2003 Toyota Highlander, just staring out the front of his car. And so this time, Christian pulls up right next to him, he parks the car, he walks right up to the window, and he's a little bit more forceful, friendly, but forceful with Bryce. He has him roll the window down, and Bryce obviously is very surprised to see Christian again. This is the third time he's seen this car repairman, and Christian says to him, hey, Bryce, you need to go home. Your parents are so worried about you. You need to leave right now. In fact, I'm going to watch you leave, and then I'm going to follow you onto the highway to make sure you're going home. And so Bryce was a little bit taken aback at how forceful he was being, but he would ultimately say, okay, yeah, all right, let's leave. And so Christian gets back in his car, and he goes right behind Bryce. And after a few seconds, Bryce pulls out of the lot, and he starts driving onto the road, and Christian follows him. And for the next hour, Christian would just remain behind Bryce and watch him drive towards Laguna Niguel. And while he was driving, Christian would actually call Karen and Mike back, and he would say to them that, your son had not left, but now he's good. He's on the highway. I'm right behind him. He'll be home soon. And so when Christian and Bryce made it to the last leg on the way to Laguna Niguel, Christian was confident that Bryce was fine and he would get home under his own steam. He wasn't driving erratically. Everything seemed normal. And so Christian pulled up alongside Bryce. He kind of waved to him to say, I'm leaving. And then he turned around and he headed back to Buttonwillow. Shortly after this, Karen called Bryce. Bryce picked up the phone. He's still driving. And Karen tells him, okay, you're going to give me landmarks of the things you're seeing as you're driving so that I know you're actually driving home. But Bryce refused to give them to her. He would say, I can't see anything out my window. It's too dark and I don't know where anything is. And so despite Karen and Mike getting so frustrated with him, saying, come on, tell us something, give us a sign, a road sign, anything, tell us anything around you, Bryce didn't give them any information. And so finally at about 2 a.m., when Bryce really should have been in Laguna Niguel or very close, he tells his parents over the phone that he's too tired to continue and he needs to pull over and take a nap. At first, his parents urged him to just keep on going. Come home. You can sleep as long as you want when you get here. But as they were saying it, they realized their son had been awake for nearly 24 hours at this point, and it's the middle of the night. So it does kind of make sense for him to pull over and take a nap. And so they say, okay, pull over. But as soon as you wake up, you need to call us so we know you're back on the road. So Bryce says, no problem. I'll do that. And they hang up. Several hours later at 8 a.m., Karen and Mike have still not heard from their son, and they're telling themselves that he's probably just sleeping, he's totally exhausted, I'm sure he's fine. And then they hear their doorbell ring, and they're immediately so relieved because they're thinking, Bryce is here. He's finally arrived. Thank goodness. They run to the door, they open it up, and it's not Bryce, it's a police officer. And the officer asks them, do you own a 2003 Toyota Highlander car? And so Mike and Karen's hearts sank and they say, yes, our son Bryce drives that car. The officer told them that the car had been located a few hours earlier at the bottom of a 25-foot cliff near Castaic Lake. Castaic Lake is about halfway between Buttonwillow and Laguna Niguel. They told the parents that there was no sign of a driver. Bryce was not there. They did find 2 small drops of blood inside the vehicle, but beyond that, there was no indication that Bryce had sustained life-threatening injuries from this crash. They said the back window of the vehicle had been broken from the inside, indicating that Bryce had escaped the wreck by punching out that window. His laptop and phone were still in the vehicle, and his wallet and duffel bag were outside the vehicle on the road and looked like they had been rummaged through before they were left there. After an examination of the damage to the car, the final tire tracks that led down to where it had been found, and traffic cameras in the area, it was concluded that Bryce had actually intentionally driven off this cliff, and he had actually hit the accelerator right before he went over the edge. After Mike and Karen headed out to the crash scene and had a chance to talk to some of the investigators that had been looking for Bryce, they informed the parents that most likely what they were looking at with this crash was a failed suicide attempt. But Mike and Karen, they just couldn't buy that. That was not like their son. And just 2 weeks earlier, when they dropped him off, he was happy, he was excited to be at school, he was talking about the future. He was not someone that was suicidal. And so what situation could he have possibly gotten himself into in just those 2 weeks that was so bad it would lead to something like this? It made investigators and the parents wonder, was Bryce hiding something? What did he mean when he said he had a lot to talk about? Did that have something to do with this thing he was hiding? A huge search was launched in and around the area where the car had been found, with hundreds of people on horseback, on ATV, on foot. There were helicopters in the air. They put divers in the lake. They looked everywhere for days and days and days. But nothing was found of Bryce. On the 9th day of the search, they brought a bloodhound out to see if it could pick up Bryce's scent, and sure enough, it did, right at the crash site. And the dog followed the scent all the way down to the lake. It walked around the lake to this bridge. It was actually a dam that went across the lake. It followed his scent right across the bridge to the other side, and then it kept on following it up this small access road until it reached a truck stop. And then his scent just stopped. And so police and the parents and everyone involved in this investigation was really surprised at this discovery. And so police got another bloodhound, a separate bloodhound. They brought it out to see if it could do the same thing, to prove that this really was his scent trail. And sure enough, the bloodhound picked up his scent. It went down to the lake, it went around to the bridge, went over, went to the truck stop, and then it just stopped. But after the scent trail was discovered, there was no other leads for anyone to follow. And so after 3 weeks of looking everywhere for Bryce, the search was called off. Some say Bryce was suicidal suicidal. That's why he drove off the cliff. That was a suicide attempt. And despite the bloodhounds picking up his scent, Bryce was most likely in the lake somewhere. Others disagree and say Bryce is still alive, that after this crash, he gets out of the car and he walks down to the lake, he walks around to that bridge, he goes up to the truck stop, and then he hitches a ride with someone and vanishes, and now he's living off the grid somewhere. And still others believe Bryce's drug and alcohol use caused a psychotic break, and that was what was causing all this strange behavior, and that was what led him to drive off the cliff. And perhaps when he landed, he sustained a vicious head wound that caused him to forget who he was, and so now he's just kind of wandering around somewhere, not knowing who he is or knowing that he's a missing person. As for his parents, they say he would never do this on purpose. He would never cause this much pain to the people that love him, and so he must have been a victim of foul play. But regardless of what you believe happened to Bryce, something happened to him, and it's probably connected to whatever it was he said he needed to talk to his mom about. That thing that he couldn't discuss on the phone that potentially he was trying to drive home to talk to his mom and dad in person about. But unless we find Bryce and he's still alive, it's unlikely we'll ever know what it was. Since August 30th, 2013, when Bryce went missing, no one has heard from him and no one has seen him. If you think you have information about Bryce Laspisa, please call this number now. Let them know what you know, because his parents, volunteers, the police, there's so many people still looking for him, and so any bit of information could crack this case. So please, if you have information, call this number.